You ruined everything. Do you hear me? Everything. My mom warned you people not to park there, and you ignored her.
The HOA president's son beat my 20-year-old daughter into a coma over a parking spot. She lay unconscious in a hospital bed for 42 agonizing days, while the police did absolutely nothing. Corruption ran deeper than we ever imagined. The system we'd trusted our entire lives failed us completely and utterly. Then my family showed up. Retired Marines, former Special Forces operators, private investigators with decades of experience. We dug deeper than anyone thought possible. We exposed lies that had been carefully hidden. We brought truth into the light no matter how ugly it was. And we made certain that justice was served, no matter what it cost us. Before I tell you this story, please comment below and let me know what country you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more incredible true stories that need to be heard. The morning of Tuesday, June 14th, started like any other ordinary morning in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I woke up next to my wife, Jennifer, at exactly 6:30 in the morning. Warm sunlight was streaming through our bedroom window, casting those beautiful golden shadows across the walls. I could hear birds singing their morning songs outside, and somewhere off in the distance, a neighbor's sprinkler system was running on its automatic timer. It was one of those absolutely perfect summer mornings where everything feels right with the world. The kind of morning where you honestly can't imagine that anything could ever go wrong, where you feel blessed and grateful for the life you've built. My name is Michael Torres. I'm 52 years old, and I spent 30 years of my life in the United States Marine Corps before I retired 5 years ago. My entire life has been built around discipline, structure, honor, and doing things the right way. I raised my children to have integrity and strong moral character. I taught them to respect other people and to always stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. My wife, Jennifer, is a high school teacher. She's kind, deeply compassionate, and honestly the strongest person I've ever known in my life. Together, we'd built what we thought was a good, safe life in our neighborhood, a peaceful community where we truly believed our children could grow up protected from the ugliness and violence of the world. Our daughter Sarah was 20 years old at that time. She was finishing up her second year at State University, studying environmental science with a real passion for protecting the planet. She was brilliant, incredibly kind-hearted, and had never been in any serious trouble in her entire life. She volunteered every single weekend at the local animal shelter. She helped elderly neighbors with their yard work without being asked. She was genuinely the kind of person who made the world a better place just by being in it. Our son Marcus was 17, a senior in high school. He was quieter than his sister, more introspective and thoughtful, but equally good-hearted and caring. He wanted to study engineering and build things that would help people. Both of our children had been raised right here in this neighborhood since they were very small. They knew everyone on our street. Everyone knew them and loved them. This was supposed to be their absolutely safe place in the world. We had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for 12 years by that point. It's exactly the kind of neighborhood you see in those glossy real estate magazines. Pristine, perfectly maintained lawns. Beautiful homes that people take real pride in. Tree-lined streets where children ride their bikes safely. The HOA was strict, yes, but it had always been fair and reasonable. Some rules existed to keep the neighborhood beautiful and safe for everyone who lived there. The HOA fees were reasonable and manageable. The community meetings were usually peaceful, civilized affairs where neighbors discussed things like lawn maintenance schedules and street lighting improvements. That was before Karen Henderson moved in and changed everything. 3 months before that terrible Tuesday that destroyed our lives, the Hendersons moved into the house directly next door to ours. That house had been sitting vacant for 8 long months after the previous owners had relocated out of state for a job opportunity. I remember those moving trucks arriving on a Saturday morning in early March. Jennifer commented that morning that she really hoped they would turn out to be nice neighbors, good people we could build a friendship with. If only we had known what was coming. If only we could have seen into the future. Karen Henderson was a woman in her early 50s. though she dressed and acted like she was still in her 30s. She had sharp, angular features, and even sharper tongue, and this particular way of looking at people that made you feel immediately judged and found completely wanting. Her son Tyler was 23 years old, handsome in that entitled, privileged sort of way, with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. Behind them came moving truck after moving truck, all filled with expensive furniture and designer everything. It was crystal clear from day one that they had serious money. The real question was whether they had any sense of community, any kindness, any basic human decency to go along with all that wealth. The answer, we learned very quickly, was absolutely not. Within the first week, Karen Henderson showed her true colors, and what happened next turned our peaceful neighborhood into a battlefield. Stay with me, because this Christmas season reminds us that sometimes the people who seem most put together are hiding the darkest secrets. Within the very first week of moving in, Karen had already filed formal complaints with the HOA about our neighbor to the left, Robert Chen. She claimed his fence was the wrong shade of brown, according to some rule nobody had ever heard of. She complained loudly about Mrs. Patterson's beautiful flower garden, claiming the colors somehow clashed with what she called the neighborhood aesthetic, whatever that was supposed to mean. She even complained about the angle at which our neighbor David had parked his truck in his own driveway, claiming it violated some obscure rule buried deep in the HOA bylaws that absolutely nobody had ever enforced before. People in the neighborhood started avoiding her almost immediately. The neighborhood Facebook group, which had always been such a pleasant, friendly place to share advice about local contractors and celebrate community events like birthdays and graduations, suddenly began filling up with complaints about the new neighbor and her impossible demands. Someone even started a private group called Oak Ridge Watch, where people could vent about Karen's increasingly absurd and unreasonable complaints without her seeing what they were saying. It became a safe space for frustrated neighbors. But here's the thing, Karen Henderson was smart. She was calculating and strategic. She started attending every single HOA meeting without fail. She volunteered for multiple committees. She made these long, passionate speeches about maintaining standards and protecting property values that sounded reasonable on the surface, but were really just about control. She worked the system brilliantly. Within just 6 weeks of moving into our neighborhood, she had somehow managed to get herself elected to the HOA board. Within 3 months, she was the board president, wielding enormous power over everyone's lives. We didn't know at the time that she was using completely underhanded tactics to get there. We didn't know she was making private deals with certain board members, offering to help with their personal projects in exchange for their votes. We didn't know that she was quietly compiling detailed files on every single resident in the neighborhood, looking for ammunition she could use against anyone who dared to oppose her or question her authority. What we did know was that life in our once peaceful neighborhood was changing rapidly, and definitely not for the better. The sense of community we'd all cherished was being systematically destroyed. Sarah came home from college on that Tuesday afternoon in June. She had just finished her last exam of the semester and was genuinely excited to be home for the summer break. She planned to work at the animal shelter she loved so much and spend quality time with her family. She had texted her mother that morning, saying she'd be home around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I was still at work that day. I worked as a consultant for a private security firm, helping businesses and organizations develop comprehensive safety protocols. It was good, meaningful work that allowed me to use all the skills and knowledge I'd developed during my 3 decades of military career. I was sitting in the middle of an important meeting when my phone started ringing. The number on the screen was our home phone. Jennifer would never, ever call me during my workday unless something was seriously wrong. My heart immediately started pounding. I excused myself from the meeting room and answered the phone immediately. Michael. Jennifer's voice was shaking, terrified in a way I'd never heard before. Michael, there's been an incident. Sarah's been hurt badly. She's at the hospital. You need to come right now. Everything after that moment feels like it happened in slow motion, like I was moving through water. I remember the frantic drive to the hospital, running every red light, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I remember running through the emergency room doors, nearly knocking over a nurse. I remember that awful smell of antiseptic and the constant sound of machines beeping all around us. I remember the doctor's grave, serious expression when he told us that our daughter had suffered severe, traumatic head injuries and was currently in a medically induced coma to prevent further brain damage. What happened? I kept asking over and over, my voice breaking. What the hell happened to my daughter? The police were already there at the hospital. They took our statements, asked us questions we couldn't answer. According to multiple witnesses, primarily a teenage boy named David, who had been doing yard work near Badeler Henderson, had viciously attacked Sarah in the alley directly behind our house. The boy's statement was clear and detailed. He said Tyler had shoved Sarah violently against her car, punched her multiple times in the face with a closed fist, and then thrown her to the ground and kicked her repeatedly in the head and body while she was down and defenseless. Sarah had simply been trying to move her car. One simple, completely innocent act. She had been parked in a community guest parking spot in front of our house. Apparently, Tyler Henderson had decided, in his arrogant mind, that particular spot needed to be reserved exclusively for his family's use. When Sarah came outside to move her car, after he'd been banging on our door demanding she move it, he confronted her aggressively. According to David's detailed account, he heard Tyler screaming at Sarah, calling her horrible names, saying she thought she was better than everyone else, that she needed to learn her place. He heard Sarah trying to calmly explain that she was moving her car, that she was being completely cooperative, and then he heard the violence begin, the sounds of fists hitting flesh, Sarah's screams, the sickening thud of her body hitting the pavement. What happened in that hospital over the next 42 days tested every ounce of my faith and strength. And when the police refused to arrest the man who'd nearly killed my daughter, I realized the system was more broken than I ever imagined. This is where our fight for justice truly began. The hospital became my entire world, my second home. I spent 18 hours every single day in Sarah's room, sitting in that uncomfortable chair, watching my beautiful daughter lie completely motionless on that hospital bed. She was connected to so many machines that breathed for her, machines that monitored her heart rate, machines that literally kept her alive. The doctors kept using these clinical, terrifying words, like traumatic brain injury, severe cerebral, oedema, and medically induced coma. They patiently explained to us that they had deliberately put her into a coma to allow her brain time to heal from the massive trauma. They said the swelling in her brain was extremely severe and life-threatening. They said multiple skull fractures would require surgery. They said she was lucky even to be alive at all. Lucky. I absolutely hated that word. There was nothing lucky about what had happened to my daughter. Jennifer spent the other 6 hours at the hospital when I wasn't there. Between the two of us, Sarah was never alone for a single moment. Our son Marcus came every single afternoon after school let out and just sat with his sister, holding her limp hand, talking to her about nothing in particular his day at school. Funny things his friends had said, plans for the future as if she could somehow hear him through the coma. She could. The doctors honestly weren't sure what coma patients could or couldn't perceive. The hospital waiting room became our entire world. Bad coffee that tasted like sadness and desperation. Uncomfortable plastic chairs that made your back ache after hours and hours of sitting. Other families dealing with their own personal tragedies, their own desperate prayers, their own fragile hope that their loved ones would somehow wake up and be okay. On the 4th day, the neurologist sat us down in a private consultation room and explained something that shattered what was left of our hearts. He said there was a very real possibility that Sarah might never wake up at all. And even if she did somehow wake up, there could be severe, permanent brain damage that would affect her for the rest of her life. He said she might never walk again. She might never speak properly. She might never be the Sarah we knew and loved. She might need full-time care for the rest of her life. Jennifer cried harder than I had ever seen her cry in our entire marriage. She buried her face against my chest and shook with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. I held her tight and told her to have faith, told her that Sarah was strong and a fighter. I told her that our daughter would come back to us. But inside, deep inside, where I couldn't let anyone see, I was absolutely terrified. Inside, I was falling apart piece by piece. While we were in that hospital, dealing with the horrifying reality that our daughter's life hung in the balance, something else was happening back in our neighborhood. Something that made everything so much worse. Tyler Henderson wasn't arrested. When I first learned this fact, I thought it had to be some mistake or miscommunication. There may have been some confusion in the paperwork. Surely the police would investigate this case properly. Surely there would be criminal charges filed. There was a witness who had seen everything. David Chen had given a completely clear, detailed account of exactly what happened. I called the police department myself, demanding answers. I spoke with the detective who had been assigned to the case, a man named Detective Morris, who sounded tired and evasive. The witness saw everything, I told him, my voice rising with frustration and disbelief. That teenager saw Tyler Henderson attack my daughter, unprovoked. That's assault. That's aggravated battery. That's attempted murder. Why hasn't he been arrested? Detective Morris's voice was careful, neutral, maddeningly calm. Mr. Torres, we're still actively investigating the incident. It's not as clear-cut as you might think, based on one witness statement. What do you mean it's not clear-cut? I practically shouted into the phone. A teenage boy saw the entire attack happen. My daughter is in a coma, fighting for her life. What more evidence do you need? Yes, sir, but the suspect is claiming self-defense. He's saying that your daughter actually attacked him first, and he was defending himself. My blood ran ice cold. That's an absolute lie. My daughter would never attack anyone. She's never been violent in her entire life. We have to follow the evidence where it leads, Mr. Torres. Right now, it's essentially he said, she said. We're looking into it, but these things take time. Within just a few days, everything became dramatically worse. Karen Henderson had hired an expensive, high-powered lawyer. That lawyer immediately started spreading a false narrative through the community, a complete lie that Sarah had actually attacked Tyler first and that he was the real victim here. The lawyer had somehow found people who were willing to testify that Sarah had a supposed history of violence and aggression. They claimed she was known to be unstable and dangerous. Every single word was a complete and total lie. But those lies were spreading through our community like poison, infecting everything. Karen was using her position as HOA president to advance this false narrative aggressively. She was calling special meetings. She was collecting written statements from residents. She was systematically painting my innocent daughter as the aggressor and her violent son as the victim who had simply defended himself. I started keeping track of absolutely everything, every lie, every false statement, every abuse of power. I created a detailed file that grew thicker with documentation every single day. 21 agonizing days passed. Sarah remained in her deep coma, unresponsive to any stimulation. The doctors continued to warn us, gently but honestly, that she might never wake up at all. And still, Tyler Henderson walked around free, living his normal life, while my daughter fought for hers. The district attorney's office told us they didn't have sufficient evidence to file criminal charges. When I asked them specifically about the eyewitness, they said the witness was just a teenager and that his account might not be considered reliable enough for prosecution. They suggested that I consider accepting that this was simply a case of two young people who had gotten into a fight, and that pursuing charges might not be worth the additional stress on my already devastated family. Stress on my family, as if the stress of watching my daughter slowly dying in a hospital bed wasn't already completely unbearable. I knew then that the system had failed us completely, and I had to make a choice: accept this injustice, or fight back with everything I had. What happened next showed the true power of family in this Christmas season. It reminds us that sometimes justice requires extraordinary measures. I hired a lawyer immediately. Good one, expensive, highly recommended by a friend who was a judge. His name was Robert Davidson, and when he reviewed our case file, he was absolutely outraged by what he saw. "This is corruption, plain and simple," he said, looking through all the documentation I'd collected. "Someone in that police department is protecting the Henderson kid, and this HOA president is blatantly abusing her power to cover up her son's crime. This is a textbook case of aggravated assault and battery. In any normal situation, charges would have been filed immediately, within hours. We filed a formal complaint with the state police. We requested that the case be transferred to another jurisdiction, where there might be less corruption. We demanded that the district attorney explain in writing why no charges had been filed despite clear evidence of a violent crime, but nothing happened. Nothing changed. The system that I had always believed in, the system that I had proudly served my entire adult life, had failed my daughter completely and utterly. It had failed our entire family. The rage I felt during those long days and nights was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my life, even during combat. I would sit in Sarah's hospital room late at night and feel it building inside me like pressure in a volcano, a white-hot fury that threatened to consume everything and everyone around me. Part of me wanted to hurt Tyler Henderson the way he had hurt my daughter. Part of me wanted to make Karen Henderson feel even a fraction of the anguish and pain that we were feeling every single day. But I was a Marine. I had been trained for 30 years to control my emotions, to follow orders, to work within the system. And so I sat there, hands clenched into tight fists, jaw aching from clenching it so hard, and I waited for a system that was never going to deliver justice. It was Jennifer who first suggested reaching out to my extended family for help. We were sitting in the hospital cafeteria one afternoon, barely touching the sandwiches we had bought from the vending machine, when she said quietly, "We need help, Michael, real help, professional help. We need someone who can actually do something about this corruption. My family, the Torres family. What we don't often talk about openly, what most people don't fully understand, is that we come from a very long line of military service. My father was a Navy SEAL who served in Vietnam. My uncle was in counterterrorism for 20 years. My brother was an Army Ranger who served multiple tours. My cousin owned a successful private investigation firm that specialized in complex cases. My nephew was on an elite tactical response team. When neighbors would whisper about us being a family of SWAT snipers, they weren't entirely wrong. They didn't understand the full depth of knowledge, connections, and resources we actually possessed collectively. I called my father that same evening. I told him absolutely everything, every single detail. I told him about Sarah's critical condition. I told him about the false statements being spread. I told him about the police, who seemed completely unwilling to act. I told him about Karen Henderson using her HOA position to cover up her son's violent crime systematically. My father listened in complete silence until I finished. When I was done, he said firmly, "I'm coming. We're all coming." That night, my father arrived at the hospital. He was 78 years old, but he still moved with the sharp focus and intensity of a man half his age. He spent 2 full hours going through every single document I had collected. He read the eyewitness statement multiple times. He studied the medical reports carefully. He read the police reports and all the lies that Karen's expensive lawyer had been spreading through the community. When he finally finished reviewing everything, he looked directly at me with those steel-gray eyes and said, "This is worse than what you told me on the phone. This is organized corruption at multiple levels, and we're going to expose every bit of it systematically." Over the next week, my entire family mobilized like a military operation. My cousin, who ran that private investigation firm, immediately began digging deep into Karen Henderson's background and history. What he uncovered was absolutely shocking. In the state where she had lived before moving to our neighborhood, there were multiple serious incidents involving her son, Tyler. A DUI arrest that had been mysteriously dropped with no explanation. A sexual assault complaint filed by a young woman that had been quietly settled with a substantial payoff to the victim in exchange for her silence. A violent bar fight where Tyler had beaten someone badly enough to hospitalize them. And yet somehow those charges had been dismissed. My uncle used his extensive connections in law enforcement circles to verify all of this information independently. He compiled everything into a comprehensive, professionally documented report that would stand up to scrutiny. Meanwhile, my brother contacted a journalist he knew, personally, a woman named Rebecca Chen, who worked for the state newspaper and had built a strong reputation for investigating corruption and abuse of power. We met with Rebecca in a private, secure location. We showed her absolutely everything we had uncovered. We gave her all the evidence about Karen's systematic abuse of her HOA position. We gave her all the information about Tyler's lengthy history of violence. We gave her copies of the false statements that had been made to the police. Rebecca's eyes grew wider and wider as she carefully read through all the materials we'd compiled. "This is big," she said finally. "This is a major investigative story, but I need to verify everything independently through my own sources. I can't just publish based solely on what you've given me, no matter how compelling it is." "We completely understand," my father said firmly. "That's exactly why we're giving you time to investigate this properly and thoroughly. But please do it as fast as you possibly can. Our granddaughter is running out of time." Day 40 came and went, with no change. Sarah was still in that coma, and the doctors were losing hope. But then something happened that changed everything. Stay with me, because what happened next proves that truth and justice can still win, even against a corrupt system. Day 40 came and went. Sarah was still in her coma, still unresponsive. The doctors were becoming increasingly concerned that she might not wake up at all, that the damage to her brain might be too severe to overcome. On day 41, I was sitting completely alone with Sarah in her hospital room late at night. Everyone else had finally gone home to try to get some sleep. The hospital was quiet, except for the steady beeping of machines and the soft hiss of the ventilator, keeping my daughter alive. I held her hand. It felt so small and fragile in mine, and I cried. I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a small child. I cried for my beautiful daughter lying there so helpless. I cried for the terrible injustice that had been done to her. I cried for the broken system that had failed us so completely. I cried for the rage that was consuming me from the inside out. "Come back to me, baby," I whispered to her, my voice breaking. "Please come back to me. Please fight. We're fighting for you down here. We're not going to let this go unanswered. I promise you, Sarah, I promise you with everything I am that the people who did this to you will face real justice. Just please come back to me." I don't know if she heard me. I don't know if anything I said reached her in whatever dark place her mind was trapped in, but I made a solemn promise that night, and I meant every single word of it. The story broke on a Thursday morning, and it hit like a bomb going off. It was front-page news on the state newspaper's website, with a headline that screamed, "HOA leader faces corruption allegations. Cover-up suspected in brutal assault case." Rebecca Chen's reporting was absolutely devastating and comprehensive. She had done her job perfectly, professionally. She had independently verified every single thing we had given her, and she had dug up substantial additional information on her own, through her sources. She had interviewed the teenage eyewitness, David Chen, who happened to be her cousin. She had obtained sealed police records from the previous state, showing Tyler's extensive history of violence. She had tracked down and interviewed the young woman who had settled that sexual assault case, who bravely agreed to go on record. The article detailed in shocking detail how Karen had systematically abused her HOA power. It showed exactly how she had used her position to retaliate against residents who didn't agree with her or questioned her authority. It showed how she had filed complaints specifically designed to intimidate and control people. It showed how she had somehow secured favorable treatment from local law enforcement through connections we were only beginning to understand. By Friday morning, The story had been picked up by every single major news outlet in the region. By Saturday, it was trending nationally on social media. #Ocaran was the number 3 trending topic nationwide. People were outraged. The pressure became absolutely immense and immediate. The district attorney, suddenly facing intense public scrutiny and demands for accountability, somehow found evidence that had previously been unclear. The police department launched an internal affairs investigation into possible corrupt connections between certain officers and the Henderson family. Within 72 hours, Tyler Henderson was finally arrested and formally charged with aggravated assault and battery. Karen Henderson, facing mounting pressure and possible criminal charges of her own for obstruction of justice, actually tried to flee. She packed her car with suitcases and was heading out of town when federal agents stopped her at a checkpoint. The expanded investigation had revealed that she had bribed an HOA board member and had filed multiple false reports with police. These were serious federal crimes. She was arrested and held without bail. It was day 42 when Sarah finally woke up. I was sitting beside her bed like I had been every single day for over 6 weeks. Jennifer had gone home to try to sleep. Marcus was at school taking his final exams. It was just me and my daughter in that quiet hospital room. At exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, Sarah's right hand moved. It was just a small movement, barely noticeably slight twitch of her fingers. But I felt it through her hand in mine. My heart jumped into my throat. "Sarah," I said urgently, leaning close to her face. "Sarah, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." Her hand moved again, more deliberately this time. She was trying to respond. I pressed the call button frantically. Within minutes, the room was filled with doctors and nurses, all running tests, checking her responses, shining lights in her eyes to check pupil dilation. Sarah's eyes were fluttering, confused and unfocused, struggling to open. The neurologist looked at me with a genuine smile, the first smile I'd seen from him in 6 weeks. "She's waking up, Mr. Torres. She's fighting her way back to us." I called Jennifer immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I called Marcus at school. I called my father. I sent messages to my entire extended family. Sarah was coming back to us. Our prayers had been answered. The next several days were an emotional roller coaster. Sarah regained full consciousness, but she was deeply confused and disoriented. Her speech was slurred and difficult to understand. She didn't remember the attack at all. The doctors explained that this was actually common with traumatic brain injuries. Sometimes the brain protects itself by completely blocking out traumatic memories. But she was alive. She was awake. She was fighting to recover. The road to recovery was long and painful, but Sarah's strength inspired everyone around her. And as justice finally began to be served, we learned that sometimes when the system fails you, you have to create your own justice. This Christmas reminds us that miracles do happen when families refuse to give up. The road to full recovery was incredibly long and painful for Sarah. She underwent months and months of intensive physical therapy. Her speech therapist worked with her for hours every single day, patiently helping her regain control of the muscles that controlled speech. Her physical therapist helped her slowly, painstakingly relearn how to walk, how to coordinate her movements, how to use her body again after lying still for so long. There were difficult setbacks along the way. There were days when she couldn't remember simple things, when her memory would have these frightening gaps. Days when frustration and anger would overwhelm her, and she'd break down crying. Days when the headaches were so severe and debilitating that she could barely function at all. Days when she would look in the mirror and cry in despair, terrified that she would never be the same person again. But there were also beautiful victories that kept us going. The day she said her first complete sentence, clearly. The day she took 5 steps without any assistance. The day she looked in the mirror and smiled at her own reflection, recognizing herself again. These small victories became the precious light that kept our entire family moving forward. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Tyler and Karen Henderson moved forward steadily. Tyler, facing overwhelming evidence and enormous public pressure, eventually took a plea deal to avoid trial. He pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and battery. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, not enough in my opinion, but at least it was something. At least he would face some consequences. Karen's case was much more complex. She faced multiple serious charges: corruption, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to cover up a felony crime. Her trial lasted 3 full weeks. The evidence presented against her was absolutely damning. Witness after witness testified about her systematic abuse of authority. Documents clearly showed her quid pro quo deals with other board members. It became crystal clear that she had systematically used her position to intimidate, control, and punish anyone who dared to oppose her. She was convicted on every single count and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. Additionally, she was ordered to pay substantial restitution to Sarah for her medical expenses and suffering, and to the other residents whose abuse of power she had harmed. Sarah is now completing her junior year in college. She transferred to a school much closer to home, partly because of her ongoing recovery process, but also because she wanted to be near her family. She still has occasional severe headaches. She still struggles sometimes with anxiety and panic attacks related to the trauma she experienced. She still has some gaps in her memory from that day and the weeks that followed, but she is absolutely thriving. She joined a victims advocacy group and speaks passionately at schools about the dangers of violence and the critical importance of reporting crimes. She has become a powerful voice for justice, not just for herself, but for countless others who the system has failed. Marcus finished high school with honors and is now studying engineering at the same university as his sister. He's naturally protective of her, like any good brother would be, but he also gives her the space she needs to heal and grow on her own terms. The neighborhood has changed dramatically for the better. The HOA is now run by a board that actually serves the community instead of trying to control it. The guest parking spot sits mostly unused now. People have quietly lost interest in it, perhaps because of the terrible history attached to it. On the anniversary of Sarah's awakening from the coma, we had a big family dinner. My father was there, my brother and his entire family, my uncle, my cousin, everyone who had fought for Sarah. We sat around the table together, and Sarah raised her glass to make a toast. "I want to thank my family," she said, her voice now steady and clear and strong, "for never giving up on me, for fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself, for showing me that justice is possible, even when the entire system fails you." I looked at my daughter, healthy and whole, and alive and strong, and I felt the rage that had consumed me a year ago transform into something completely different. It transformed into profound gratitude. Gratitude for my family, who had stood with us. Gratitude for the journalist who told the truth. Gratitude for the legal system that, in the end, finally did deliver some measure of justice. People often ask me what I would do differently if I could go back. Would I go through the legal system again? Would I take a different approach? I encourage others in my situation to do exactly what we did. The answer is complicated and not simple at all. Yes, we bent some rules along the way. My cousin's private investigation crossed some legal lines. The information we obtained wasn't all gathered through completely proper channels. We used connections and resources that most ordinary people don't have access to. We circumvented a broken, corrupt system, but we also did it right in the ways that mattered most. We didn't break any serious laws ourselves. We didn't hurt anyone physically. We exposed the truth through a legitimate journalist working for a real newspaper. We allowed the legal system to work once the truth was finally exposed to public scrutiny. Would everyone be able to do what we did? Honestly, no. Most people don't have an extended family full of people with law enforcement connections. Most people can't afford to hire private investigators. Most people don't personally know investigative journalists who will take on their case. So what's the real answer? What's the solution? The answer is that the entire system needs to change fundamentally. We desperately need law enforcement officials who aren't vulnerable to corruption or political pressure. We need HOA boards that actually serve their communities, instead of serving their own selfish interests and egos. We need a legal system that moves quickly and decisively when someone is seriously injured or their life is in danger. We need to believe victims and witnesses, especially when the evidence is clear. The system failed to do that for Sarah, but, through sharing her story, we can inspire the kind of change that will help someone else's daughter, someone else's family,